Regarding those 529 people, we will look at a short story on that a little later in the programme, but how does the Muslim Association of Britain react to these verdicts?
Well, in utter disgust, really. I mean, we are totally dumbfounded. How is it that 529 people, some of them in absentia, as you mentioned, have got a sentence for the supposedly killing of one police officer in a protest which was quite lawful, quite valid. It wasn't the protest against the law following the draconian acts of banning protests. So it was within the law to do what they were doing. And here they are, rounded up and given a sentence which has never been given in the history of Egypt. And I think we here at the Muslim Association of Britain call for support from all directions, from my colleagues, like I said, at Amnesty International and others, who can put pressure on the rightful return of democracy, freedom and justice in Egypt. And that's what's really needed. Well,
we will discuss those verdicts a little bit later in the programme, but regarding that report we saw there in the news, Amnesty International looking at executions taking place throughout the world, China, well, the Egyptian verdicts came in to speak at the conference. But what does that report tell us?
Well, I think firstly it tells us that there has been a sharp spike in executions. But the truth is just 3 countries have been responsible for that. That's Iraq, Iran and Saudi Arabia. We saw 778 executions last year in 22 countries. That's almost 100 more than we saw the year before. But I think overall there's a positive picture as well. More and more countries are turning away from the death penalty.
Okay. Now, why was China excluded from that report?
Well, that's a very good question. The truth is because there is so little information on what's happening in China, but also because we believe that thousands of people are being executed. China is really in a league of its own, but because what happens there happens in the shadows, we decided not to include it in the official report. We included only what we could substantiate. And China, as we all know, we're not able to substantiate because there's not really the information that we can get there.
Okay, before we do move on, we saw a few other stories there. We saw Turkey there and their role getting closer to Syria. Erdogan, lots of rhetoric, YouTube being closed down as a result of a leaked video involving Syria. What does this tell us about Turkey's involvement in the Syrian conflict?
Well, we've always known that Turkey has always supported some of the rebels in Syria. And we've known also that Turkey, and in particular the Prime Minister, is under a lot of pressure, having called the events in Egypt to be unlawful. So therefore, I think what we're seeing is that as a natural, if you like, pressure systematically being put on him. I'm not sure it would be correct to bar YouTube and all the rest of these things as a way of stopping the dissent.
That was involving a leaked video that they said was completely inappropriate, right?
Yes, I understand that, but I think people are able to get. It's like saying don't look at the pink elephant. People are going to try and look at it. They're going to try and find it. They're going to try and. So I think there's other alternatives he can use apart from just trying to ban that information from coming out. But it does seem to me that there are concerted campaigns against him and his leadership at the moment. It's a very difficult time for him.
Okay, well, we saw the Arab Summit this year, or this week also, where lots of countries got together. That summit could very well not have happened because of relations between Qatar and a few other countries. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is certainly involved in that conversation. Is Qatar alone there, Nicholas?
Well, I think there's clearly, a very clear divide between Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood in the past and Saudi's, opposition to that support. And I think that's drawing a line in some sense between these countries. But I think, certainly in relation to Egypt, we have to take a step back and look at the response of all of the international community. It took states more than 6 months to speak out against the situation in Egypt in the Human Rights Council, for example. And that's despite the deaths of hundreds of people on the 14th of August at Rabat al-Adawiya. So it's not just about the, spat between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, it's about the damning silence of the rest of the international community as well.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to this discussion, but early in the programme you saw the news, Egypt, and the sentencing of over 529 individuals. Here's a little more on this story.
Earlier this week, a criminal court in Egypt ordered the execution of 529 people, said to belong to the Muslim Brotherhood. The defendants were standing trial for the killing of a police officer and the attack on a police station during unrest last year. The death sentences are the largest mass conviction in the history of modern Egypt. and led to protests worldwide. On Monday night in Britain, people gathered in front of the Egyptian embassy in London, dismayed at the court ruling and calling for the British government to take action. I went along to the demonstration and spoke to some of the protesters.
It's in reaction to an absolutely deplorable verdict on the 529 people in Egypt. It's something that's never happened before in the history of Egyptian people, and we are absolutely outraged.
We're here to say no to the Egyptian regime, to the military coup, because they're killing us, they're arresting our children, they mess the country around, and we will keep refusing what they do. Even if they kill all of us and all of our children, we will keep saying no to them.
Security forces fired tear gas at students in Alexandria University on Wednesday as they staged further protests against the court ruling. Students have been staging demonstrations in universities around the country. One person was reported to have been killed in clashes at Cairo University. Many of the protesters made the four-fingered Rabah sign to show solidarity with supporters of President Morsi, who were killed by security forces last August at Rabah Adawiya Square. The protests continued as Egyptian Army Chief Field Marshal Abdel Fattah el-Sisi resigned his position as the head of the armed forces in order to run in the upcoming presidential elections. This came as news of Egypt's public prosecutor ordering a further 919 members of the Muslim Brotherhood to stand trial on charges including terrorism and murder. Many of the defendants at Monday's hearing, where 529 people were sentenced to death, were detained and charged for carrying out attacks during clashes that erupted in the southern province of Minya, following the forced dispersal of 2 Muslim Brotherhood protest camps in Cairo on August 14th last year. Student protester Omima Mehdi was critical of Egypt's judiciary.
من رأيي إن هو أساساً حكم باطل من الأول، ولو هو حقيقي مش باطل ما كانش بكل دوت حصل، علشان أساساً إحنا عارفين إن القضاء عمره ما بيبقى على حق، وقضاءنا من زمان جداً إحنا بنطالب بتطهيره، ودي كانت غلطة كبيرة إن إحنا ما طهرناهوش، وسيبناه يتطهر بنفسه، فأكيد إن شاء الله الانقلاب هيترنح خلاص، وبإذن الله كله يخرج من المعتقلات.
Turmoil has deepened since the army overthrew Egypt's first freely elected president, Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, in July. Security forces have killed hundreds of Muslim Brotherhood members and activists during protests and arrested thousands of others. The Muslim Brotherhood has been largely driven underground, responding to the death sentences by calling for the downfall of military rule. Since the deposition of President Morsi last year, Egypt has suffered the bloodiest internal strife in its modern history.
Some very difficult images to look at there. Still with me in the studio, Nicholas Piachaud and Khalil Charles. Now, some really, really disturbing images there. Right at the end of that feature, burnt bodies. We've seen lots of violence in Egypt. Now, how do we move forward? I know, Khalil, you were at the demonstration on Monday and I spoke to you there, but how do we move forward out of this situation in Egypt?
Well, we have to recognise that what has happened with the sentences and the violence that has ensued after the July 3 coup is that the military have now essentially made a country which is ungovernable. The judiciary is now not worth not worth anything. No one trusts the judiciary, and it is really a nail in the coffin, if you like, for any kind of justice coming out of the former Mubarak regime over there. And what we're seeing there, if there is to be any kind of justice, is for the people who support and give a right-hand signal and agree with what Sisi is doing. For anybody who
Sisi does have support.
We're not saying that there isn't support, but what we are seeing is a polarization of two sides, which only one side is being recognized. There are definitely people who support, of course, the removal of the Muslim Brotherhood. However, the other side is being ignored and being vilified and butchered, and now termed as terrorists.
Nicholas, what are human rights organizations doing, and how are they working with people on the ground in Egypt?
Well, I mean, we're doing a lot of documentation, so we're publicizing the human rights violations that are happening, and we found that the security forces have committed gross abuses when suppressing Mohamed Morsi's supporters. We're also talking to other governments and encouraging them to break their damning silence on the situation in Egypt. But let's be clear, right now Egypt is spiraling towards an unprecedented human rights crisis. And it's time for, independent and impartial justice. It's time for courts to stop locking up Mohamed Morsi's supporters while ignoring gross human rights violations by the security forces. They are literally letting the police get away with murder.
Okay, Mohamed Morsi himself is also arrested, right?
Well, Morsi is facing, I think, at least 4 separate criminal trials. But, let's be very clear. Some of Mohamed Morsi's supporters did commit human rights violations, and Mohamed Morsi himself may be responsible for crimes. But we won't know that unless they are given the fair trials that they deserve under international law. What we saw on Monday was a gross violation of justice, in which over 580 people were sentenced to death following a summary trial in which the judge didn't consider the evidence, the prosecution didn't read the charges, and in one part of the session the lawyers were completely banned from attending the trial at all.
Okay, well, thank you both very much. We do have to move on to Twitter. Lots of different stories have been trending throughout this week. Let's have a look at some of the things you've been tweeting about.
As mass trials continue in Egypt, Twitter will set abuzz in support of Egyptian prisoners. At Riza Biza tweeting, "How did 500 people kill one cop?" Early this week, the US welcomed the imminent departure of UN human rights investigator Richard Falk. The long-standing controversial figure reported the injustice in Israeli policy towards Palestine. The crisis in Egypt and the conflict in Syria dominated the Arab League summit in Kuwait, and at Palestine added the Arab League refuses to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Violence continues in Central African Republic as the country marks a year since a rebellion and coup plunged it into chaos, with @Rohan Hayat tweeting that there is a lack of exposure in the media.
Right, so you've seen what's on Twitter and you've heard from our guests. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for this evening. I want to thank both of my guests for joining us and, of course, you at home for watching. Remember to keep up with the Twitter conversation using #TheReport. We'll be following stories throughout the week, so do keep tweeting. If you prefer, you can email us your thoughts on the report at islamchannel.tv, and to watch some of our previous programmes, go onto our YouTube channel at /IslamChannelTV. But for now, we'll leave you some scenes from San Diego Zoo, where a baby gorilla who came down with pneumonia after being born in a rare cesarean section has improved enough to be released from his hospital and be visually introduced to his resident gorilla troupe. Do join us next week for your report, but until then, from all of us here, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you both very much.
Thank you for you.